In this lecture, we're going to talk about the idea of the university, like what it is, why it is, and then start to move into looking at the concept of interdisciplinarity and kind of how that has evolved. So we live in a world full of problems. We have social problems, we have political problems, health problems, environmental problems, mathematical problems, educational problems, so many problems. And because of all of those problems, people tend to kind of get a really kind of narrow tunnel focus almost on that issue. So, if you're interested in the problem of climate change, you're probably going to take some sort of biology or environmental science class and then really, really focus on that. And you're not thinking about all of the other pieces around it. You're not thinking about the political impacts or the social or the cultural impacts. You're just really focused then on that natural science focus right there. So we see this kind of hyper specialization in a lot of different pieces. And so when you get to that point, you're like this person in this photo, right? You're alone amongst a crowd. You have that really specific knowledge, but it's not connected to anything else. You have, like you see here, you have gaps around you, gaps around your knowledge. You guys are used to probably hearing about hyper specialization when you're thinking about college, right? So you're 16 years old and people start asking you what you're going to major in. And so people really want you to have some clear idea and some specific focus when you come into it. I was in school and I started majoring in 6th grade. I went to magnet schools and we had to pick a major. So I guess actually in 5th grade to start in 6th grade. I was a visual arts major in middle school and then a computer graphics major in high school. And so having to fix these specialties super early like that can lead to a lot of unintended consequences. When you're trying to figure out school, nobody's asking you what are the gen ed classes you're going to take, right? They're focused on that really specific narrow area. And so just another little cartoon here that kind of demonstrates that when you really focus on one thing, you lose the ability to do all of the other things because you're so focused on that one piece. So take a minute. I'm going to be showing you a lot of quotes in this lecture today, and I want you to really just think about them beyond what I'm telling you about them because they can generally be interpreted differently for different situations and different perspectives. And so I want you to hear what I'm saying, but then also think about what you think about that as well. We're talking about the university today, and as a university professor, I'm clearly biased toward the concept, right? I wouldn't be teaching here if I didn't really believe in it. And so you can have different perspectives on this formal education. So here we see a quote that says, at one time, all knowledge about human, social, and physical nature was viewed as one, right? And so that was actually, when you think back to like the ancient philosophers, they were the ones who created this idea of knowledge as a concept. And so it was all seen as forms of philosophy. And then as that developed over time, we saw moral philosophy and natural philosophy come out of it. And then those started to break apart. I have some examples up here so you can see there's just a few examples. There's so many more. But this was really, in the 20th century, these things started to kind of solidify because we had more free time, right? We had the Industrial Revolution. And so now people weren't doing a lot of the more labor or time-intensive tasks. And so there was free time to sit around and think about more kind of complex or abstract concepts. So we have out of moral philosophy, psychology, history, economics. Out of natural, we have math, physics, biology. And then I've also put on here neuroscience. And so this is a newer one, especially at WVU as a major. But this is kind of showing interdisciplinarity in action now. And so they broke apart for so long. There were all these different branches, and they're starting to come back together. So psychology and biology together create neuroscience as a field. And so this is something that we're going to be talking about a lot, the value of interdisciplinarity, how it really is kind of an easier way to come to solutions and problems, so you have those multiple expertise. But if you're familiar with the program at all, I just wanted to share that because neuroscience is a really good example of it kind of stopping the breaking apart and starting to come back together. And so before we get to that, when we have all this specialization, we have kind of an increase in the creation of knowledge. We have a proliferation of knowledge creation because everybody is getting so narrowly focused. There's such little minute details for them to write about that there's so much literature. And so, you guys have to read papers for classes, but then think about your professors, these people who are actually doing the research in the field. They have hundreds of papers to read in a month a lot of times, right? And so that just kind of gets to a point where it's impossible to keep up with. So I want to use Humpty Dumpty as an example for this. So we have Humpty Dumpty, who's going to sit in place of the world, or all of everything that exists. So this includes all the different problems that we have, but really everything that exists in our lives. So when you have, here a nice clean egg shape, for lack of a better term, it's just all put together as one. And so you're looking at it and you're seeing one. You're not seeing all the multiple pieces here. It's just the shell. You're not seeing what's inside of it, right? So to kind of break past that, we'd push Humpty off the wall. So we'd break him, and now we have all these small pieces. And so this kind of represents all the disciplines that everything has proliferated down into over time. And so with that, we can just pick out one piece of the shell and then become an expert in it. We'll get to see like all the different contents in it. We'll see all the different shapes. We'll really, with a discipline, we'd be able to do all of the readings on that one specific area. And so this is demonstrating what we've kind of got out of philosophy. So Humpty as a whole is philosophy, breaking down over time into these little pieces. And so we spent time with the little pieces, and we want to kind of put it back together to be able to use it as a tool to problem solve, except we're only experts in one piece. And so with one piece, like when you're looking at a puzzle, if you only know the shape of one piece of the puzzle, you can't put it back together with all the other pieces. So without that, we're kind of lost, right? We don't know what to do. So if we become experts in multiple pieces, we'll be able to see how things start to fit back together. So you would basically become an expert in two pieces, and you'll see that connection. And then if your colleague is an expert in two pieces that overlaps with one of yours, they'll be able to see that other connection. And then so slowly over time, you can put them back together. So here we have Humpty Dumpty back together again. And this is interdisciplinarity. So here you can see all the cracks, you can see all the different sections, but they're still fitting together to create that whole. So they're still telling that story as one. Hopefully that makes some sense. So taking that example, we're moving into understanding what interdisciplinarity is. And so it's becoming an expert in more than one area. Instead of being hyper-focused in one small thing, you're being still focused, but at a broader level in multiple things. And so with you in your MDS major, you're an expert in 3 things, right? So you have 3 foci instead of 1, or instead of a million. So there's a lot of different examples of kind of disciplines or units that you would already be familiar with that are inherently multidisciplinary. So public policy, criminology, business management, and then we have area studies, which is kind of focusing on specific areas. So like examples, women's studies or Native American studies that we have here. And so with any of these, you can kind of pull them apart and see, okay, what are the different disciplines that are involved in that? So public policy, that would be political science, economics, sociology, probably even more in there. Within that, usually there's going to be kind of like a leading discipline, a leading focus. So with public policy, I would probably argue that political science is kind of the leading focus there, because it's kind of the foundation to shaping public policy, and then it's impacted by economics and by sociology and everything else. And so the leading discipline is often helpful for guidance. Sometimes it's not helpful because it kind of drowns out other voices. So it's something else to be aware of when you're kind of becoming an interdisciplinarian. So when you kind of achieve interdisciplinarity, you're like the ants, right? The ants are all working together to achieve one goal. They all have different jobs, but they all fit together perfectly to get the stick across the hole. Maybe a bad example, but hopefully you understand what I'm going for. So now, moving on, what is the purpose of the university? So I'm really hoping this is something you've already asked yourself before you got here, ideally. But if not, we're going to kind of walk through it together. So I see a university as being multi-purpose, right? We have like the book learning, getting that specific factual knowledge in, but then you're also building skills in your classes, like communication skills, writing skills, all of that. But then there's also a big place in college for self-discovery, right? You build discipline. You have to get yourself up in the morning and go to class, or you have to work on your time management to get all your assignments in or to do all of your reading. There's the aspect of getting an actual qualification, right? So you're getting a degree of some sort, and that's going to lead you on to future paths. So having that actual tangible thing to carry with you. But now, especially the modern university, it's also just housing, it's sports, it's entertainment. It's kind of like a halfway house between living at home with your family and then being fully independent. So there's so many different purposes to the university, and I think they're constantly changing and evolving, and they're always going to be a little different for each person. So from one of the readings for this week, the idea of the purpose being to transmit useful knowledge is talked about quite a decent amount. And so I'd like you to think about that. What does that mean? What is useful knowledge? How do you quantify something like knowledge to decide what's useful and what's not? So now, looking at this is just to kind of get a general overview for how higher education really broadly has developed in the US. So we had colleges from the beginning. Almost as soon as wealthy people got here, universities started, right? And so we can really connect that to this idea of the university as an elite institution. So we had the colonial colleges. A lot of them are still around today. We had the American Revolution, where it kind of started to formalize a little bit more. It started to spread out to more people, but it was still very much an elite concept. And then in the 19th century, we had a lot of legislation to expand access. And so most of us would not be here in a university without what happened then. So there was this idea of creating more universities. So we have land grant institutions coming out of that, like WVU, and that's to serve a local purpose, serve the community. There's also a really big ag focus. So kind of building skills within people to help them contribute to our society, right? So to create the things that we actually needed. And then the concept of access has just kept growing and going and going throughout the 20th century into today. It's depending on your perspective, I think it's starting to kind of turn back, right? And so we're starting to move away from this idea that everybody should go to college to people shouldn't have to go to college if they don't want to. And so there's some mixed messages, I think, that have come through over time and have been kind of pushed through to make people think about university a little bit differently. But that's kind of progress so far, and I'm sure this trajectory will change in 20 years when I come back and update these slides. And so some of the key things that happened during the 20th century were the civil rights movement, of course, but people got louder, right? And institutions became a place for making a statement, making a stand. You saw lots of protests from students and from faculty, and universities were often this beginning of movements, right? So you had enough people around there who were thinking and listening to each other, which doesn't necessarily always happen outside of this context. Like, it's supposed to be a place for listening. And so these different, more progressive ideas evolved out of that. We also had a lot more funding coming from the federal government because of World War II. So we had the GI Bill that really, really expanded access to education for people who served, but also they can share the GI Bill with their children if they want. So we had a whole new group of society able to finally come to university. We had increased population that is starting to kind of slow now, which I think is kind of the impetus for a lot of the changes we're starting to see in terms of people's perspective toward higher education. And then we also got a much more diverse curriculum. Gen Ed foundations fit within that. A lot of people are not big fans of Gen Ed, but it was the idea of kind of educating the whole person and giving a really decent general understanding of everything. And so this is a little bit more unique to the US. And universities in Europe tend to focus much more narrowly, especially from the beginning. So they generally don't have gen ed curriculums. You don't have to take an English 101 class or a math class. You just go in straight. If you want to be a communications student, you only take communications classes. So it's a different approach to the idea of general knowledge and what a student should know at the time of graduation. So this is more focused toward the US context for now. But so increasingly, there's been a shift from outside perspectives toward the university that it shouldn't be about knowledge creation specifically or only, because that's kind of an intangible. It's something that doesn't have immediate gratification. And instead, it should be focused more on financial outcomes. So either doing research that is going to immediately make money for the university or for the government or for some other funder. If you talk to your professors about their grants, the work that they're basically doing or what they're being funded for to be able to do their research. Those grants, they come from all different places, largely from the federal government, but also from other outside sources. And then alongside that kind of push toward making money, there's also the push toward making what happens in education directly fit with a path to a career. So students increasingly are saying that they want to know why everything they're doing in the class is going to fit in with their career. And if it doesn't have that direct connection, why are they doing it? So it's kind of around building an employable workforce. And so there's not the direct income to the university or to the government, but to the individual, which benefits everything else. That's kind of a growing perspective. So here's another quote that I want you to read. This is from the president of Harvard University at, I think, their inauguration. It's in one of the readings. But so a university is not about results in the next quarter. It's not even about who a student has become by graduation. It's about learning that molds a lifetime, learning that transmits the heritage of millennia, learning that shapes the future. And so think about your perspective on that. For me, that's kind of in contradiction to that move toward the economic focus that I just talked about, right? This idea of lifetime having an external or an extended value that's going to last decades and decades, that's not a good return on investment when you're thinking about money, right? But when you're thinking about society or thinking about the individual, there's probably going to be what some people would consider to be an even greater benefit than a financial benefit. There's going to be a lot of connections between who that person is, who they become in college, and the impact that they have. That will have kind of a knock-on effect that's economic for sure, in terms of what sorts of career they devote themselves to or how they just contribute to the population more broadly, how they're engaged as a citizen. But that money doesn't come right away. So this is kind of looking at education as a long-term investment, and that it shouldn't be seen as a commodity. It should be seen as kind of like a public good. There's another quote: "A university that molds itself only to present demands is one that's not listening to its historians." So same kind of idea, but here they're also kind of bringing in this kind of thought that there's an aspect of ignorance coming into it. They're ignoring the past specifically for some sort of reason, right? So this means that a university should be constantly evolving, right? We have, even in the time that you guys have been in college, there's been a massive proliferation of technology that relates to education. And so if a university were to ignore all of that, take our learning system, Blackboard, right? eCampus. Until this past couple semesters, it looked very similar to the equivalent that we had at my college when I was an undergraduate, and I graduated in 2008. So the learning experience, especially like thinking about online classes through COVID, the learning experience has actually been really handicapped by that, right? We've been held back by having not the best technology, we'll put it at that. But so now we have this new Blackboard Ultra, which is incorporating a lot more external programs that you can use. You guys are going to be using them in this class with Perusal and with Harmonize, like video discussion boards. It makes the online experience a lot more collaborative, a lot more engaging. And so here we're learning from what's available to constantly evolve, constantly improve. And so the thing that I want you to leave this lecture with today is think about what is useful knowledge. So for you, if somebody were to ask you what the useful knowledge that the university should be transmitting is, what is it? So I was a history major as an undergrad, so I probably have a very different perspective on what's useful knowledge. I was very interested in Spain and the New World. Conquistadors and the church really, really interested me. A lot of you probably could not care less about that. That's fair. That knowledge is not necessarily something I'm using regularly, right? I'm not teaching you about conquistadors in Peru, right? You're welcome. But so I still think that there were a lot of skills and things that I took out of my history classes that are paying dividends now. So just think about the idea of useful knowledge. And if you haven't already chosen your 3 minors, this might be a good way for you to kind of start narrowing that down. So we're going to be doing a lot of assignments that kind of connect to that. So think about what the useful knowledge is and then see where it fits back into what we offer at WVU.